My name is Nicholas Levis. I am a writer and researcher. I did not write Chapter 4. It was written by financial lawyers who would prefer not to be on camera today. So I have read it, I know the issues, and I will be summarizing what's in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called A Little History to Explain a Lot of Tragedy. And the history is that of capitalism in the United States and in the world, where prior to 1929, you had gigantic financial crashes where banks would fail due to gambling and speculation about once every 15 years, and you'd get economic disasters as a result. And the biggest one then happened in 1929 with the Wall Street crash and caused what we call the Great Depression. And in the wake of this unprecedented economic disaster, with 25% unemployment in the United States, a commission was appointed, the Pecora Commission of the Congress, to investigate the causes of the crash. And what they decided, first of all, was that banks were gambling with money that was not secured with depositors' money, and ended up in this disaster. So they recommended what then became a law called Glass-Steagall, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1934.
1934?
1934. It passed right away after the election of Roosevelt. It's an interesting contrast to today, where 5 years after the election of Obama, in the wake of the 2008 crisis, we still don't have the Dodd-Frank Act implemented. Glass-Steagall, by comparison, was much stronger and very simple. What it said is banks can't gamble with depositors' money. If a bank takes money from the people, from depositors, you cannot engage in high-risk speculative activities. They have to engage in normal commercial activities, loans to businesses, mortgages, and so forth. And what they also set up at that time was the FDIC, which insured deposits of normal depositors, and thus banks that were receiving this deposit insurance could not engage in speculative activity. And what you had from then on was normal commercial and consumer banks that were where the deposits were insured and that could not speculate, and then you had what are called investment banks that could do whatever they liked but had no security. They would not be bailed out by the people, by the taxpayers. So you had this firewall set up by Glass-Steagall from 1934 forward between commercial banks and investment banks, and you had deposit insurance for the commercial banks. And the commercial banks also had access to the low interest or lower interest loans at the prime rate from the Federal Reserve, which investment banks did not. And this created a much more stable financial system that did not have major crashes for 50 years, which was unprecedented in the history of capitalism or the United States. However, there was always opposition to the Glass-Steagall rules, because banks really wanted access to that low-interest money from the Federal Reserve. Commercial banks would like to engage in this kind of high-risk speculation that brings higher returns. So you always had massive pressures from the banking lobby to break it down. And this started then in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan and the turn towards the neoliberal policy and deregulation across the board of most industries. You started having the first steps towards deregulation and loopholes in Glass-Steagall, and there was a massive run of speculation in the 1980s on savings and loans institutions, which started getting into very high-risk and sometimes scammy real estate deals and losing billions and billions of dollars. So you had an unprecedented number of bank failures, but the banks were generally small. You had something like 600 bank failures in the 1980s. One difference in the 1980s from today is that you also had massive prosecutions of the miscreants. If bankers engaged in criminal activity and they were caught, they were prosecuted, and 1,000 of them went to prison. Today, in the wake of the massive scams of 2002 to 2008 with the mortgage-backed securities, 0 bankers have gone to prison for those frauds. The ratings agencies who called everything AAA that was rotten securities, they have not been touched. So after the 1980s wave of bank failures, which were not fatal to the economy, however, at the same time you had growth, because this was happening in a fairly limited sector, the savings and loan sector, where there was less regulation and less opportunity for these speculators to get in. You started getting more and more loopholes and more financial innovations that found ways to get around the rules. So you started having some spectacular failures in the 1990s that, however, did not set off the dominoes, such as the hedge fund long-term capital management, which did require a big injection of money into the markets from the Federal Reserve. At the time, it was said to prevent a general crash. So already you had the outlines of what we were going to get in 2007 to 2008. But 2 more key steps now happen. In 1999, the Glass-Steagall Act was finally repealed. So from 1934 to 1999, you had this firewall, and from 1999 forward, it became legal for any institution to take depositors' money, to engage in standard commercial business and mortgage activities, and also to engage in the equities markets and the bond markets and derivatives and everything that is risky and potentially high yield. And this came about because Citibank wanted to merge with the Travelers Insurance Company and act as an investment bank. And they actually had this merger before the law was repealed. They merged first, and then they lobbied to get the law repealed. Congress responded. This was a Republican and Democratic-sponsored act, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, that repealed Glass-Steagall, signed by President Clinton. So you had a bipartisan consensus, and backed especially by Clinton's economics advisors, who are still around today and have at times advised Obama, Larry Summers and Robert Rubin especially. And you had Greenspan. These were kind of the trinity. Men were going to save the world, according to a Time magazine cover. Well, they set up the burning of the world, but an opportunity for men of their class to really enrich themselves. And then in 2000, the next year, after the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and an announcement, in effect, that the banks could have a free-for-all, you had the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And this was really fascinating because the market in derivatives was growing to absolutely epic proportions, where all the bets on the various values, interest rates, and stocks, bonds, all these sovereign bonds, all these bets actually amount to something like 10 to 20 times the value of all assets on Earth. So these are unpayable bets and enormous risks that are being carried. If these bets fail a certain way, you would have a general economic crash. No one would be able to pay. So Brooksley Born, who was the head of the Commodities Regulation Agency, the CFTC, she said at that time, she warned that the derivatives market needed to be regulated. At the very least, it needed to be brought to light, because derivatives consist of contracts between private parties that are not public. So they can be kept in the dark. No one actually knows how large and what kind of risks are being taken. So one of Brooksley Born's proposals was to bring it out into the open, to have an open exchange of derivatives and to ban especially risky activities, such as you have with the stock market. You would have, in effect, the stock market for derivatives. Well, the banks went insane at the idea, and the holy men came out. Summers, Rubin, and Greenspan all attacked Brooksley Born. She was treated like the devil in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, and they actually passed a law that not only didn't regulate derivatives, but said you may not regulate derivatives. It banned the regulation of derivatives. So you would set up the situation now for a total free-for-all where any institution could take depositors' money or money from wherever it could get, borrow from anybody else, lend to bad risk, lend out a lot of bad risk mortgages, package them as AAA securities. You know the whole story that led to the mortgage-backed securities crash in 2007 to 2008, which we can get into more detail if you like. So this is how the crash was set up in 1999 with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and in 2000 with the ban on regulating commodities. After 2008, you've had the crash, and the government feels compelled, and the Federal Reserve feels compelled to bail out these enormous institutions who were responsible for the crash, the big Wall Street banks, because if one of them fails, all of them are going to fail, and there's going to be a domino effect around the world. You're going to have a gigantic banking crash. As far as I'm concerned, that's exactly what should have happened. They should have been liquidated, reorganized, taken in under the laws that exist for such situations, and by now we would have a new system set up where the banks are a lot smaller and where you have some version of Glass-Steagall again. But of course what they did was the bailout, and then in a kind of weak way, they implemented the Dodd-Frank Act. I shouldn't say they implemented it, they passed it. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 is the new banking regulation. And one of the provisions that it has is called the Volcker Rule, written by Paul Volcker, a former, or suggested, I should say, by Paul Volcker, a former head of the Federal Reserve in the 1980s. Paul Volcker wrote a kind of lighter version of the Glass-Steagall rules that would limit what kind of speculations banks that take money from depositors can engage in. And what happened is the regulators and lobbyists got their hands on it and turned it into something like 1,000 pages of loopholes. And they basically made it that it's never actually going to provide protection against a repeat of the crash, because banks can basically claim they can continue to engage in high-risk activities by claiming that it is a hedge against a failure of one deal or another. The market makers can do this. What does this mean? This means Citibank, let's say, is going to issue shares in Microsoft, and they're holding the shares in Microsoft and underwriting them until these get sold to shareholders on the market. So meanwhile, they're holding some kind of hedge against a possible failure of Microsoft. Okay, this is supposed to be a legitimate form of insurance against getting caught with their pants down. There's a sudden drop in Microsoft by 50%, Citibank would go out of business. So they need some kind of hedge. However, they can also claim they need some kind of hedge against very high-risk derivatives deals, and thus justify holding derivatives that they're never actually going to sell, because these might be very exotic products, high risk, high return, that the bank wants to hold itself, and no one's going to come and buy it, but through this loophole they can hold as many derivatives as they like, basically. So the Volcker Rule is not going to do the job. Furthermore, it hasn't been implemented yet. There have been constant delays. Our sister group, the sister group of alternative banking, is called Occupy the SEC, and they actually sued in federal court to say, hurry up and impose the Volcker Rule. It's in the interest of everyone to not have a new crash, and the Volcker Rule will provide some kind of protection against it. The court, I should say, the federal court ruled that the lawsuit has no standing. That means the people bringing it are not actually participants in this economy, or not sufficiently participants in this economy. So you and I have no interest in not seeing a new banking crash and a new economic disaster and unemployment back up at 18%. Only banks, only legitimate one-percenters could bring such a lawsuit. So that's been quashed, and that's the situation today. The banks that caused the crash are larger than ever. Their executives have not been prosecuted for criminal activity. They have not been limited from engaging in the kind of speculation that led to the crash in the first place. And they are engaging in this kind of speculation in constantly new and innovative forms, and we're just set up for the next crash. Again, prior to Glass-Steagall, there was a huge economic crash due to banking failures. Every time, banking crash followed by economic disaster, once every 15 years on average. And that's where we're heading now. We are 7 years since the last crash now almost.
How come it was fairly easy to get the Glass-Steagall Act back then, compared to?
I think this was a more innocent time where the system was not as self-aware as it is today. I think the bankers were more surprised, whereas today they know what, really they work to create these crashes, because that's where the big money gets made. You know, the winners of these crashes end up bigger, and they can buy up all the losers, they can buy up all these assets on the cheap. That's really what this is about. That's my own opinion about how the dynamics are always going to play out. It's partly a function of human nature and partly a function of this is what you get when you have a private capital disposing of itself and always looking for the highest possible yield in a competitive environment. You know, there's always going to be enormous incentive to engage in high-risk behavior, and they don't want regulation. Back in the 30s, you know, they were just caught by surprise. The disaster was so enormous. You didn't have Social Security. You didn't have unemployment insurance. The U.S. was in a genuine pre-revolutionary phase. I mean, union membership jumped by something like 10 times in just a couple of years. And you had a much more, if not radical to an extent, a much more militant working class. And there was a genuine fear in the ruling class that you know, the United States could go the way of the Bolsheviks. There was the Red Scare of that time. And Roosevelt was a genuine reformer. He said, I'm going to save the capitalists from themselves. And that's what he ended up doing. He put rules in place that kept the system stable for the next 50 years.
But you say they caused these crashes, but that must be short-term thinking from their part. I mean, like on a short-term basis, yes, they will have benefits, but in the long term, it has to be suicide for them also.
I shouldn't say they cause these crashes or plan out when the crash is going to come. I should say they set up these situations where they know these crashes are going to come, and they also prepare for the inevitability of a crash and to make money from it. And again, they are very skilled at pursuing their own interests and at getting rid of obstacles to enriching themselves as individuals and as small groups, as businesses. But they are not particularly skilled, you know, or they don't particularly care about the world will burn and maybe it'll turn on us, you know, and they don't really fear it because check it out. We just had this massive crash and this economic misery. In many other countries, that's meant millions of people in the street. In this country, it has not. It feels secure. You know, the people in the United States still believe in this system, I think is what it comes down to. You know, or enough in this system, or they feel trapped in it. You know, maybe that's more the truth. They feel trapped in it, like what is the alternative going to be? I am in precarity, I have to work 2 jobs just to pay the rent and feed the children, and you know, I don't really have time to organize a kind of resistance. So you really have a lot less class consciousness and you know, this readiness of the people to come together as a mass. And you have a lot of Confucianism today. You know, I mean, you've got media telling people constantly this kind of libertarian line that it's all your fault, there's too many goodies coming from the public sector, the real problem is the government deficit, you know, and when in fact it's the deficits that have kept the economy afloat at all in the last 5 years.
As a movement, what can Occupy do? I mean, what can be done in general, I should ask? And as a movement, what can we do?
Well, We are not even in a pre-revolutionary phase. And I'm sorry to be speaking of revolution. It doesn't necessarily mean that we storm the institutions, burn down the buildings, and chop off all the heads. It means we need a different system. We need a change so radical that the system will no longer be recognizable to us today. And for this to happen, we need a long phase still of just talking about it. It's a big part of the problem. We still need to educate ourselves and to come up with the right ideas for alternatives. And we need to fight together and do things like be prepared to occupy factories. Like the next factory closure, will the workers be able to take it over, or the next workplace closure? What will they do with it? You've seen this kind of thing in Argentina after the crisis in 2002, where you had a lot of worker-controlled businesses suddenly arising that had failed, and the workers said, no, we're not fired, we're taking it over. And a lot of these still survive. You've got a couple of examples in Greece. You don't really have many examples, or any examples in the U.S. of such a thing. So I think it's going to be a long process. We don't necessarily have time for this.
No.
We live in urgent times. We really need to reform a lot more than the financial system. We've got a disaster with energy, where we're burning the planet to keep the lights on, and it's the warmest day I've ever seen. Today is the first day of winter. It's 65 degrees outside New York. That could be just the normal variations in weather patterns, but damn, they've been varying one way for many years, and all the scientific evidence is saying that that's us. That's our civilization, I should say, not each of us individually equally responsible, but our civilization is pumping all this carbon into the air and not really paying attention to the consequences. So, how do you get people motivated? I don't know. I've been asking myself that question for 30 years and trying what I can. Sometimes I lose my motivation too, so maybe I'm not the greatest revolutionary in the world. Philosophers have tried to understand the world, but the point is to change it, right? Well,
Okay.
I would say come to the alternative banking group with your ideas, your concerns. Right now, one very encouraging thing that's happening is that people are understanding you can't have people on starvation wages. All this stuff like Walmart, asking its workers to pay so that other workers can eat during the holidays, and they are workers at Walmart. They're not making enough to eat. They're not making enough for insurance. This kind of thing is coming out, so you've got the fight for $15. I think that's an excellent start. That's the kind of issue we really need to be focused on. Raising the minimum wage to a living wage, to a wage with dignity, so that people aren't working, but are working, but can't pay for themselves even. It's ridiculous.